Hi everybody! My name is Michelle the Bookworm, and in this week's video I'm going to be reviewing the book Alice in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, hence the Alice in Wonderland-esque attire. So this book was written in 1865 by a man named Reverend Charles Lutwig Dog, aka Lewis Carroll. And I'd first like to, I did a little bit of research going into this, or after reading this novel, and a common misconception about Alice in Wonderland is that the author partook in hallucinogenic mushrooms, because that is a common theme throughout Alice in Wonderland. But there's actually no evidence at all that the author partook in mushrooms. Instead, he did take a lot of opiate-type drugs, and he also suffered from a disorder that caused him to think that he was larger or smaller than he actually was. This was later called the Alice in Wonderland syndrome, based on this author. So I just thought that that was a really fun, interesting fact that I learned while I was doing a little bit of research about Alice in Wonderland. This book was part of my 100 Essential Novels poster that I recently bought myself. And yeah, it just kind of seemed like a really fun book to, I don't know, one that I've thought about reading and I'm interested in it, but I haven't read it before. So my overall thoughts about Alice in Wonderland is that Alice is this young girl who is trying to apply primary school rules to this bizarre and strange new world. And this world is totally messing up all of those primary school rules. So first I, of course, would like to talk about what I liked about the book, and then I will go on to discuss what I didn't like about the book, and at the very end I will give a overall review. So the first thing I liked about the book is the political and social critiques. I am only going to do a few because Alice in Wonderland is basically all one big social and political critique. So I will first like to just talk about a few different themes. The first one is deconstructing identity. In the chapter, The Pool of Tears, Alice is unsure if she is even herself. She thinks that she's possibly a classmate named Mabel, who's dumber, kind of like the dunce of the class, because she can't remember her primary school lectures. So this, I think, is really, really important because it allows her to let go of what is and isn't real. It's allowing her to let go of what's possible and what's impossible, and just allowing her to just experience and to just do. It also breaks down her constructed identity so that she can become and experience what she's meant to. And I think that that's really kind of important, especially for a girl as young as Alice. We aren't exactly sure how old Alice is. You don't actually get an age, but based on the lessons that she's been learning, I'm guessing it's probably primary school. Another one is that it's in the chapter, a rabbit sends in a little bill. So she grows, in that chapter, she eats a piece of cake and she grows to the size of the rabbit's house. And she's thinking to herself, well, maybe I should write a book about this when I'm all grown up. And then she thinks to herself, well, why wait? I already am grown up. And this is supposed to be kind of like a little funny haha joke. But honestly, I think that it's also talking about autonomy at a very young age. Like, during this age of, the 1800s, especially little girls are told, just let the grown-ups handle everything. But this concept of, why do I have to wait to be grown up, and taking control of, or thinking that she has control now, that I think that's pretty important. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I think it's also like another way that she's taking control of her autonomy at this point, and now that she's broken down her identity, she's like reconstructing it to someone who she is. She's reconstructing her identity by breaking down all the limitations that has been pushed on her all these years. Another aspect that I really liked about Alice in Wonderland, for those of you who don't know, I love wordplay and puns. And Alice in Wonderland is full of them. Particularly in... And Alice gets very frustrated about all of this. One of the examples is the Mad Tea Party. That I didn't realize before. It's a very common scene in Alice in Wonderland, but I had no idea that it all started because, so in the Mad Tea Party, it's a tea party that it's always 6 o'clock. And the clock stopped at 6 o'clock, and they're forced to have tea time for the rest of their lives. And in the novel, this happens because the Queen said that the Hatter, while he was playing the violin, was murdering time. So at that point in time, the clock stopped exactly at 6, and they are forever just having tea. Which I think that's really interesting, and really kind of shows also how time dictated their lives back then and today. But because the clock didn't go any further, they were forced to have tea time for the rest of their lives. This language game is actually pretty consistent throughout the entire novel, or novella. And it underscores this, like, inconsistency of Alice in Wonderland, and it also implies that the governing principles that Alice, like, thought that kind of controlled her life are really just arbitrary, particularly when it comes to time. Like, time is just a construct that we just allow us to control our lives. Yeah, I thought that was kind of interesting. Another part that I really liked, and when it comes to puns, was the Mock Turtle chapter. The Mock Turtle is, like, his entire spiel, like, when he's talking about school and what he learned in school, because he's supposed to be a very learned character, he talked about his lessons and how his lessons throughout the week got shorter and shorter and shorter, because they lessen as the week goes on. Ha, puns. And he also studied, classes such as reading and writing, ambition, distraction, uglification, and decision, which is all puns on addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, which I think is pretty funny. Though there's a lot of wordplay and puns, Carol also was very political throughout this novel. There is a whole lot of social critique throughout this novel. I'm only going to do, again, a couple examples. The first one that I'd like to discuss is the caucus race. So the caucus race is when Alice just came out of her pool of tears and she's soaking wet, and the dodo just tells her that she should run around in a circle and join this race so that everybody should join this race so that they could dry off. And it's an obvious commentary on the political system, which I kind of like. So the dodo is the one who makes out the course and delivers and decides who's the winner, which apparently everybody's the winner. I which is kind of just shows, like, it's definitely a commentary on, like, the political races. I'm not really sure or learned about the political system during this era. But obviously Lewis kind of saw it as kind of a ring around the rosy race. Another political critique that I thought was interesting was the White Rabbit mistakes Alice for his human servant Marianne. I thought that was kind of interesting it was an interesting inversion of social stereotypes. I don't know, don't necessarily think of a rabbit as, you know, a lord or anything, or even at this time a young white girl as a servant. So it was kind of, I think, a little progressive to kind of turn that on its head a little bit. And another political chapter that I thought had significant political critique was the trial of Who Stole the Tarts. Basically, in this section, the jurors are all a bunch of idiots. They don't even know how to write their name. They obviously forged the evidence, and the Queen demands a sentence before the verdict even happens. So basically it's saying that you're guilty until proven innocent. And when Alice speaks up and says, hey, this is really wrong, the Queen demands for her head. Again, this is probably a giant political critique for the justice system during this time. I'm not going to pretend to know anything about England's political history, but that's kind of just what it sounds like. And the last aspect that I really liked about Alice in Wonderland is that Alice realizes that Wonderland is a dream and then tells herself to wake up. And since and at the very end she wakes up and her sister says, well, maybe it's not, you know, you aren't supposed to make sense of Wonderland. And I think that that's kind of interesting to, like, think that making sense of Wonderland is kind of futile because Wonderland doesn't make sense at all. But there's so much political critique in this. I think it's kind of Lewis Carroll's way of saying, hey, you know I said a lot of stuff and I made fun of a lot of political things, but it was all a joke. Just to kind of save his butt a little bit. And it was also a message for the reader. The novel kind of resists definitive interpretation. Now, whether that's because he's trying to save his butt and not get in trouble, or because like the magic of Wonderland can't be comprehended. I think that's supposed to be open to interpretation. Anyway, those are the major things that I really liked about Alice in Wonderland. Its descriptive imagery was absolutely astounding. It gave me a lot to think about. There were some things that I didn't quite like about Alice in Wonderland. It did derail a lot, which possibly could be the whole point. But it kind of bunny trailed very frequently. Alice is kind of just thrown around throughout this novel, and she's getting very frustrated. Nobody's helping her, and it bunny trails in a linear-ish fashion, but it kind of just goes from she's on trial to her just waking up, so she could have just woken up this entire time. I don't know. That was kind of confusing for me. Um, Another thing that I really didn't like while reading this novel, and I didn't get it until the end, was everybody was getting pissed off at each other for no apparent reason and for just misunderstandings. Oh, wait. Maybe that's also another social critique. For instance, the mouse in the caucus race, the mouse gets upset with Alice for talking about whether the mouse meant a tale as in a story or a tale as in its tail. This is another part of the language game that Lewis Carroll did, and the mouse got really pissed off, which I don't see why all these characters are getting so freaking pissed off. At another time is the Duchess criticizes Alice for not knowing what a Cheshire cat was. It just degrading somebody just because they don't have knowledge is another, hey, that's kind of another thing that is pretty frowned upon. And the last thing that I didn't really like about this novel, or about Alice's character, is that she constantly kept putting herself in places where she didn't belong. For instance, she put herself between the cook and the Duchess when they were throwing things at each other, but she could have easily just walked away. And inviting herself to the Mad Tea Party, it was uncivil of her to just sit down and invite herself to a tea party. Yeah, I kind of feel like the Mad Hatter was right for being a little pissed off at her. So anyway, those were the criticisms that I did have for Alice in Wonderland. Overall, I actually really loved this novel. I listened to it on LibriVox.com, or not .com, LibriVox, the app. It's an awesome resource. This is not monetized by any means, but I listen to it a lot just to kind of have an audio way to listen to my classic novels. So for Alice in Wonderland, I gave it a 4 out of 5 rating. I really loved the descriptive imagery. I really loved how there was a lot of political and social critique, and it did it in a way that was still really fun and vibrant and colorful. I, in the end, gave this novella. I gave this novella a 4 out of 5, which is pretty high. I absolutely loved it. I am really glad that I actually was finally able to experience it. And I'm also really into, I don't know why I haven't read it earlier than now, because I'm really into Alice, the Alice in Wonderland, the video game series from McGee. And I don't know why I haven't actually read this book before now. So my end of the video question is, 1, have you read Alice in Wonderland, and what was your favorite political critique from the story? Or if you haven't read Alice in Wonderland, what is your favorite Alice in Wonderland, I don't want to say parody, but Alice in Wonderland fan novel, or Alice in Wonderland inspired novel, or Alice in Wonderland inspired game? Please feel free to leave a comment in the link below, and as always, thank you for watching. Bye!